The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
Now, before we get started, I'll introduce our speakers. Robin Catagnis is an associate professor and chair of the online campus of the Applied Behavioral Analysis Department at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She is a member of the trustee of the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies, a reviewer for the APA journal Behavioral Analysis, Research and Practice, Diversity and Behavior Analysis section, and a member of the editorial board for the Behavior Analyst, the flagship journal of ABAI. She is also the former founding president, Multicultural Alliance of Behavior Analysts, and a special interest group of the Association of Behavior Analysis. Bobby Gallagher holds the position of Director of Office of Placement and Training for the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, as well as being the owner of the Autism Center for Educational Services in Brick, New Jersey. She is the author of A Brick Wall, How a Boy with No Words Spoke to the World, a memoir of raising two children with autism. And now I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Catagnis. I am really excited to be here with you today. Dr. Gallagher and I are going to talk about behavior, but also a little bit of brain science, and relate all of that to happiness for ourselves and for our children.
Hold on, sorry.
This is just a brief overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to open with a short couple of minutes on our own personal stories with our families. We're going to talk a little bit about what happiness is, how you measure it, and how you can help create happier kids and families. We will cover strengths-based programming for well-being, talk a little bit about measuring quality of life and improving quality of life, and offer some strategies like rapport building and pairing with reinforcement, and also touch base around mindfulness. So this is a photo of my family, and we thought it'd be helpful for you to know how we came to this presentation. Both Bobby and I are behavior analysts. I started my career, going on 20 years ago in this field, and I was a really great behavior analyst. I was a great consultant. I thought I knew so much about how to structure programs for kids and how to deal with not only challenging behaviors, but also helping kids learn. And then I had my own kids. And I think for those of us who are professionals in a field working with children, having your own children is its own education. And then as we grew into our family, we found out one of our kids had a neurological difference. And then I found myself on the other side of the fence, so to speak. And I found myself in the same meetings I used to hold with such confidence, sitting across from people who seemed to have absolutely no understanding of my child. And to my shock, all of my knowledge really didn't help me convey my concerns for my child. So the thing I realized after I watched my kiddo melt down time and again, when there were tears, when my kiddo wet their pants because they were so upset and just could not cope. After preschool after preschool, after program and program, and professional, I came to realize I wanted my child to be happy. I didn't want to see any more tears. I was hurting for my child, and I wanted success. And those are the two things I really wanted. And I kind of stopped caring about all the other stuff, like playing with blocks and following all the rules and everything. And this was a profound change for me.
So let me chime in with our story. I am the mother of 3, and 2 of my children have autism, Alana and Austin both. Much of what I've learned over the years has really been more maybe because of Austin's challenges than Alana's, but mostly because of his reaction to much of the teaching that happened in the early years of his life, and all of the things that I followed. I've been in the field for over 20 years. I started working with other families in the area of ABA to help them with their children, but I was finding myself not being able to help my own child. But because I was really listening maybe to strategies that I knew personally should not have been done, and we were right, or should have maybe dealt with our gut and listened to that a bit. And because Austin, at the age, in this picture he is here, ended up going to Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland, for severe self-injurious and aggressive behaviors. And he truly was fighting us on all of these interventions that we thought were what was supposed to be working for him. And led us to have to place him somewhere hours away from his family, which was the hardest thing we ever had to do.
So I think where we both ended up was thinking that learning for our children, learning socially appropriate behavior, learning how to communicate, how to make friends, how to navigate school, how to learn any number of behaviors was absolutely not fun. In fact, it was leading to enormous meltdowns and very problematic behaviors. And so one of the questions I like to help people think about is, does your child like learning? Do they try to run from the teaching or intervention? Do they try to escape in whatever way they can communicate? And so this presentation is really going to be about some of what Bobby and I've learned together about blending the very powerful science of behavioral science and behavior analysis with some of the positive psychology and mindfulness research that's out there, and people are doing great work around this. And we're certainly not the first people to suggest that learning should be, voluntary, fun, and joyful, but we just wanted to share our experience. And so this is question number one. Does your child like learning? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And the sad fact is, we as professionals often inadvertently increase anxiety and make learning unpleasant. And frankly, so do parents. This works for both of us. And we're going to talk to you about why the anxiety might be related not just to the environment, but to some brain differences and neurological differences, and why intervention, quote unquote, shouldn't be necessarily leading to tears and sadness. And can we think about it instead as intervening for happiness and for quality of life and to make learning joyful? So we felt like, not only in our own programming for our kids, but reflecting on my own practice and seeing what we teach students in our field, that we're missing happiness, strengths, and quality of life as a focus. We are taught absolutely to go in and look for what we can make better, which leads to sort of a deficit model. And we fail to look for all those positives. So we're going to talk about how to do that today.
Okay. So when we first look at happiness, I think from my perspective, when we go in and we're trying to look for those things that we can change, we hear a lot about socially significant behaviors, but we also hear about socially stigmatizing behaviors. And that's often the focus of most of the programming, is that socially stigmatizing, sometimes for those children who were more like Austin was, in that he had a lot of self-stimulatory and other challenging behaviors. But what we do know now is that most parents, and I think even myself, all I can remember saying is, I just want my children to be happy. And we have data now to show that this is the important measure. This is what parents are asking us to look at as professionals. They want their children to be happy. So we need to find a way to increase happiness, and to look at it from that perspective. But why is happiness so hard? And I think for behavior analysts, we look at behaviors sort of on this external way, but there are other ways to look at behaviors. But when we're looking at individuals with autism, we're going to talk a bit more about this in a minute, but one of the things is just brain development and the amygdala's response to what's happening in the environment and how anxiety is created, in addition to which behaviors are really related to this autism or discover which behaviors might be related to the anxiety of, that's being evoked at the moment and what's going on. So we have to decide there and make decisions which behaviors are specifically related to the anxiety that's out there, and then the communication deficits that hinder their ability to talk to us, to communicate with us. And regardless of where they fall sort of on this very large spectrum of this this disorder itself, communication is still a problem, and some of these other factors come into play, the way that the brain reacts and whether or not somebody can communicate effectively during times when anxiety is high. So just a real broad definition here. Broadly speaking, an anxiety disorder is characterized by a fear response that is out of proportion relative to the actual threat, or extreme in its intensity to the extent that it significantly disrupts the individual's functioning. And one of the things we want to talk about too is whether it's situational or trait related. But with this definition, what I want to look at is their response to whether or not it's an actual threat. We often think that somebody shouldn't be afraid of something because we're not afraid of something, and that's the same with our individuals. We do know that they may find fear in situations that are social, and in other situations that most people are trying to push them to get over because we're looking at it from a different perspective. The amygdala in individuals with autism spectrum disorder has been shown to be larger than it is in typically developing individuals. What does that mean, and how does that affect what we're talking about today, happiness? Well, the amygdala is the part of the brain that reacts to fears. When somebody says to you, fight or flight, or fight, flight, or freeze, this is the part of the brain that's responding to that specific situation. By having this larger and having this area of the brain that monitors threats larger, then threats are perceived as being bigger than maybe what you or I might think them to be. So, and also with individuals with autism and this area of their brain, it may not signal when there's an actual threat. And so I think many of us can relate to this when we say that our children would run right out in the street and they don't understand that they could be hurt or worse, right? Or they may signal when there's no threat perceived whatsoever. And that again is we have to take into consideration each individual's reaction to each situation that's happening and not put our perspective on whether or not it should be a threat or should not be a threat, but how can we help the person to get past that? So the different ways that anxiety sort of reaches into our children's lives is certainly causes can be biological, physiological, or neurological, but they can also be due to some of those past learning histories as we were talking about. So for a situation for us, for Austin, certainly new people are something that he perceives as a threat and that he wants to escape. And I think, again, that many will say that he's testing the new person. I hear that a lot. And I don't want to look at it as a way to say that he's testing as much as the conditions that are being presented to him in the past have not been positive because these new people have to learn him all over again, and he knows what that means. He knows that that means that there's going to be errors and there's going to be mistakes and lots of things are going to happen. So he has an increase in self-injurious behaviors or maybe an increase in aggressive behaviors, but he certainly has cause for that based on his past history. And so we have to be able to consider all of these variables when we're making decisions about future interventions and to make sure that we're addressing all of these. One of the causes, as we talked about just a bit ago, those perceptions of those events. And so research that's been conducted in that area of PTSD and ASD, it strongly suggests that there are several potential pathways connecting both disorders. So there is research to state that this post-traumatic prevalent in individuals with autism is much higher than it is in the typical population. But one of the reasons is, again, their potentially unique perception of those traumatic events, and particularly in that area of social engagement. They are perceiving themselves all day, every day, as being in sort of a traumatic or stressful event. Some of those other causes, those biological and physiological, are certainly fears, unusual fears. So although they may be unusual, they should not be discounted. We have to look at them. I remember when our daughter Alana was little, and she would literally stop because the floor went from carpet to wood. And she would stop, crawl across, and then stand back up. And then she had an absolute fear of stairs that don't have backs to them. And one person, when she did something they did not, one therapist she had a long time ago, when she did something that they didn't want her to do, she actually took her out to a set of steps that had no backs. And when we found this out, of course, we stopped it immediately because that was horrific. But what we have to understand is she had a true fear of this. And we should help her if it's necessary, or we could take a different set of steps. You know, there are other things we can do. I think sleep disorders for most families of children with autism is not an unusual thing to think about. But what we want to think of is the sleep the challenging behavior, or does the sleep deprivation cause the challenging behavior? And so that's another reason why individuals may engage in some behaviors. And where I hear teachers or other professionals say he has good days and bad days, and not so sure if it's that should be described that way, but maybe we can figure out how we could address those days differently, as opposed to adhering to the same procedures all along the way. And then gastrointestinal issues are common within the autism community of discussion. We have a lot of talk about the different diets and things and interventions, but what I do want to point out is that we absolutely do have the research to show that children who do have gastrointestinal issues had more anxiety problems than those children who had autism who did not have gastrointestinal issues. So we are looking really at saying we can measure this, and we can prove some of the relation between the two. Some of those interventions that we, and I often will have to say that myself, have used in the past, and we have just, maybe we should stop sometimes, but I'm guilty of being somebody who has asked folks to do this, and I'm guilty of doing this even with my own children. But decreasing some stereotypical behaviors with no replacements, asking somebody to have their hands quiet, but not providing them with any other way to get the feedback that their body is obviously looking for. And now I will say to folks, if you could go to an emergency room or an operating waiting room, you will see people who rock and who wring their hands. This is a calming behavior. We have interventions where we're forcing interactions without the necessary supports, or we're throwing children into inclusive environments like gym or recess or any of those, and we're not really supplying them with what they need in order to be in those environments, which can certainly increase their anxiety. And I'm going to apologize for this typo here, but when we talk about extinction procedures, really just I've been involved with some cases and programs where individuals will place a behavior on extinction, and what that means is a behavior that in the past was receiving reinforcement in some way, maybe not what we wanted, but if somebody said to you, you keep paying attention to that, they're going to keep doing it, and then all of a sudden they just say, stop paying attention to that. And there's often mention of this extinction burst. And I really would hope that we could use some of the other strategies that we know in order to help someone to better navigate their world. But in addition, during these procedures, what we do find out is that some of our children learn some other behaviors that we really wouldn't want them to be learning. And bullying I know this is a national problem. I know this isn't an autism-specific problem, but I do know that we have lost recently here in our own state a young man to suicide after multiple bullying reports. And so it is a challenge for all of us, for all populations. But as we look at how bullying affects, again, that response, their perception of that bullying, and the amygdala, we have to take that into account. And certainly the restraints is a problem. When we look at peer aggression and restraints too, in both of these are ways in which we interact with individuals who are in pain, who are looking for answers, and then we're engaging with them in such a way that is in some ways abusive. I don't have a better word for that right now, but then when it's all over, we're asking them to kind of sit with those individuals who just performed all this with them. And that's a very confusing interaction for our individuals.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears here from talking about some of the underlying neurological differences in the way that the brain and the amygdala work, and talk about some general happiness interventions. And I do want to just add here that the amygdala is not only associated with fear. It's commonly known for that sort of in the public vernacular, but it's also related to how cues in the environment acquire significance by being associated with rewarding or aversive events. It's related to memory, modulating memory, regulating attention. So changes in affect and cognition can relate to differences in the amygdala. So just wanted to sort of broaden that a little bit, because there may be even more impacts of those differences. So when we got to thinking about happiness, it's kind of amorphous. It's hard to measure. It certainly isn't the only thing we care about, but how do we get to happy, right? So there's a field called positive psychology that's very concerned with what's called flourishing, the idea that psychology can do more than repair or decrease deficits or handle diagnostic procedures and interventions, but we can also be concerned with what makes us truly happy. And as to frame this conversation of happiness in kids, we looked to, well, what makes adults happy? And there was a big meta-analysis done by one of the folks who are Seligman, one of the father of positive psychology and one of the researchers in the field. They looked at the research that's been done on happiness interventions for adults who were in good mental health, didn't have a lot of other life barriers, who just needed to get from neutral to really happy and flourishing. And they found a couple that in the literature were associated with happiness. One was being able to do what you're good at and use your strengths. So if I'm creative, having an outlet for creativity boosts my happiness. If I'm really good at my job, getting to work might boost my happiness. But being aware of what we're good at and facilitating and fostering those strengths was associated with happiness. So was noticing the good, noticing what we're grateful for and what's working well. These two interventions in particular really boosted happiness in adults. So we then thought, well, how are we going to measure this for our individuals with autism who maybe can't tell us what feels good and what makes them happy? And there has been quite a few people in our field who are researching what they call indices of happiness, because behavior analysts are trained to look for measurable, observable behavior rather than guessing at what's going on inside someone's brain. And there are people who are measuring happiness by things like laughing, smiling, what the caregiver says brings their child happiness, what the caregiver says, my child's happy maybe when they run back and forth laughing and flapping their hands. So we are looking for ways to observe happiness in our kids and watching for that. And we define that by laughing, smiling, that kind of thing. So when you look at individuals with autism and the research on happiness indices or indicators of happiness, here are some themes. Happiness is increased by access to favorite activities, by access to preferred items, social interaction of certain kinds, quote, fun time, having choice or having control. you know what? Go back to that last slide. I just want to add something.
Sure.
I don't think this is going to surprise anyone. I think that most of us, if we said, you know, what makes us happy, having access to stuff we enjoy and people we like and getting to pick, that is going to make us feel better. We're going to have a nicer time and we'll feel happier. I think the real question becomes, how often are we specifically, thoughtfully programming this into the day of our children and adults, of those that we're working with? Or how are we asking providers to build this into programs? Thank you.
So one of the things that we can look at certainly is social validity. And in our research, we are required to look at social validity, but we do have a challenge sometimes in implementing this, maybe within the application. So one thing that we would do is look at the stakeholders' participation in the selection of the goals and the strategies that they want for their children or for their for themselves if they're one of the individuals that are participating, but actually saying to them, what do you want or what are the goals? The other part of this is also this: when we're presenting something as professionals to a family and you want to say that the best research has said that the intervention, I'll use a toilet training one that I know is frequent, but the intervention is to take the child to the bathroom every 15 minutes and have them sit on the toilet. And keep repeating this throughout the day. I remember this one from when my children were younger, and certainly said, of course, if that's what the research says, that's what I'm going to do. But what we didn't maybe look at is how that was going to impact the rest of my day and the rest of being a mom to the other children that I had to take care of, and taking care of a household and what needed to be done. So when we looked at it, are we not only saying to families, what do you want to work on? And I'm sure toilet training comes up a lot, but here are the interventions, and here are how those interventions will affect your life or affect your daily living. And so maybe we would have to opt to go through a couple more situations or possibilities if we really knew exactly what was on the table for us. And so with that, I would say that parents should be included in the choice, and mostly because what our research is telling us is that when parents are, they're more apt to follow through. So some other behaviors that individuals or interventions that may be causing some of the challenges here for individuals that we're working with are just those that increase anxiety-provoking situations. When someone says that they've conducted a functional behavior assessment of an individual, they might say to you that they're trying to escape the situation, but often what I hear is they're trying to escape the work, that the work is too hard, they just don't like to work, they don't want to do it. That's maybe not always the case, but instead that it maybe they're trying to escape these anxiety-provoking situations that cause their bodies to go into this state that they're uncomfortable with. So some of the skills that we could use to actually increase their ability to maybe stay and complete a task would be inferencing. Have we taught individuals on the autism spectrum about what will happen next? If you complete this, what could happen next? If you're able to finish this one problem, what would happen next? We need to, if you go into this movie theater or something, what will happen? Giving them that prediction of what will happen in the future, and letting them understand or start to develop that skill of being able to do that. And then the skills to increase problem solving. What would have been a different way to deal with the situation as opposed to ripping up the work or to throwing tables or doing what it is? What are some problem solving? And this gets into some of those replacement skills that we've certainly have in our repertoire as behavior analysts to make sure that we're teaching, and we'll see where somebody might teach to use a break card. But if you're going to keep bringing me back to the same thing that I asked for a break from, what are ways that maybe we can both work on this a little bit differently?
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
Would that be okay? Yeah, we see this a lot. We see escape interventions a lot where kids are trying to get out of learning. And there are people in our field who are doing really great work around just issues of ethics. So if a child keeps trying to get out of the environment, what are the ethics of putting them back in? And so there needs to be a sophisticated analysis of what about learning is aversive? And that's what we have to fix. We don't have to keep the child from leaving. We don't have to hold them in their chair. We don't have to make them work. We need to figure out how to make learning fun and fix what's aversive about the learning environment. And that's a pretty sophisticated analysis. And that's what we're sort of our call to action. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I just, based on what you're saying, I would like to point out one of the things that we did with Austin. Each time, Austin had a very sort of volatile relationship with learning. And each time we placed him into a school setting, he did worse. But each time we brought him home from that school setting, we would see him flourish and do better. And so at one point, at the age of 18, he had another one of his very difficult and challenging times. As a family, we just decided that this was not a place where he could experience this in this way. And so we brought him back home, and we provided his program for him in the home setting, and then the opportunities for him to be included with other individuals and to go to them during the day versus the opposite, where he would be taken out of classrooms because of behaviors. Instead, we brought him in when the situation was good.
And this topic, you guys will see, is relevant to typically developing kids too. Kids often want to get out of the learning environment because teachers aren't sensitive to what makes it aversive. You see it in classrooms all the time. It's a tough thing to do, figure out what a student doesn't like about learning. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I think this is Bobby's section, right? And Bobby, this is maybe just mention your own research. I'd love for them to know a little bit that you're researching in this area.
Absolutely, sure. So I am doing research in the area of, or did research, I should say, in the area of SCARF. And this is a work in the field of neuroscience. And what I was working on in particular was, I'll give you a little background on I took my daughter Alana for a gynecological visit, and it didn't go well. It didn't go well at all. And the treatment of Alana in that setting was pretty horrific. And when I came home from that, I actually called Robin and wanted to sort of change the focus and area of my research to maybe help make this a better place for females with autism to go. And so what happened, really looking at this SCARF work, the work of David Rock, and how can I help to teach other people how to interact with individuals on the autism spectrum in a way that will decrease the threats that individuals are feeling, and especially in these environments where they may not always be, they're not going to readily. We don't go to the gynecologist often. And so with that, how can I train people to look at the situation differently and look at how they could change their behavior. The simplest of things in their behavior can increase the probability of somebody complying or working through or participating in this whole act. And so David Rock's work really works on how the brain reacts. And what we know now is that the brain reacts to emotional pain the same way that the brain reacts to physical pain. And these domains of SCARF, they activate these reward and threat circuitries of the brain. So a threat status activates the same or similar parts of the brain that work the areas where somebody thinks their life may be in danger, that there's a threat to their life. But at the same time, we have areas that we can increase in that section of the reward part of the brain. And so a perceived increase in, say, fairness, and I'll review these different areas of SCARF, but in fairness might activate the same, or does activate the same parts or the circuitry that's receiving a monetary reward. So we can look at those areas and make sure that we are trying to decrease threats and increase reward situations. And this also works with the serotonin and the cortisol. So when there is a reward situation, serotonin goes up, and when there is a threat situation, the cortisol goes up in our brains.
And I'll just add that SCARF is a model that David Rock's group, NLI, pulled together from a wide number of studies and researchers and affiliations with labs and other people's work in neuroscience. And they kind of boiled it down to this really cool model that helps you understand how social threat and reward can impact the areas of the brain and, impact our ability to interact and learn. And so they did a really neat job of pulling us all together into this model.
It's wonderful. And I have to say, when I was done doing this, it just made so much sense. And it was just so simple in so many ways, but made so much sense to even all of those participants in the study. We had 17 BCBAs that learned how to train nurses in a gynecologist's office. And all of them, when it was over, found that the SCARF part of the study was the most important or significant part of what we taught them on what to do. And so SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And what we mean by these, your status is about the relative importance of others to you and you to them. And then certainty is the concerns with being able to predict what will happen in the future. And many of us want that. You know, it certainly helps all of us to know and to have certainty in our lives. And then autonomy, which provides a sense of control over events. And I will say that that may be the hardest one in special ed settings, and is giving some of that control over to the individual versus the therapist or the teacher having all of the control. And then relatedness is a sense of safety with others. Are you my friend or are you my foe? And I can't imagine any of us doesn't want to know that ahead of time. And then fairness is the perception of exchange or fair exchange between people. And so in the reason why we would want to use SCARF and use SCARF everywhere is when we're looking at how we're wired to receive threats faster for survival. So that decision to escape the situation is made much more quickly when the stimuli is presented. And I think, to Robin's point before when she was talking about how important this sort of amygdala is as well, we can also train sort of the amygdala to respond faster to threats if we keep presenting those threats. And so that's a concern as well. If you keep doing it, you can actually make the individual complete the task faster of trying to escape. So that's why we want to retrain sort of that learning history. So the threats and the rewards are the focus of SCARF, which falls in, I think, to me, beautifully with what behavior analysts do. In addition, we can behaviorally define these environments and define these behaviors within, or these domains within different environments. And so again, SCARF in the day program or in the school, things that we can look at. So status, as what we would do in a school setting, how would we define status? It would certainly be just presenting that information at the level of the client or the student. I work in a lot of day programs and often see that individuals in these programs have staff who stand over them and sort of, maybe bark is the wrong word, but giving orders, giving directions, and it's just sort of sit next to them, sit at eye level with somebody and talk up to them about what it is that you want. Certainty would be an area where I think most of us are in the field are familiar with, but making things more predictable, using pictures or other ways to increase certainty across those environments, even if the individual already does it. So even though somebody may already be engaging in a behavior or in an activity, I don't really know why we're so quick to fade off these visual supports, but we seem like we need to fade things out as though that's a higher level. And sometimes having these visuals available to people is just a great way for them to remember it, to see it, and to kind of confirm that certainty that it's going to happen. Autonomy, to me, has been a real challenge for most, but asking permission if we can engage in an activity together and honoring somebody's no. And certainly my work currently in the area of inappropriate sexual behaviors, I really want people to honor our children's no and to understand that it's going to happen. But if you think that they're going to say no to everything, then maybe we need to discuss why they want to get out of the work, which will bring us back to the beginning.
And I want to encourage people to question the concept of compliance across the board. There is no human who shouldn't be non-compliant sometimes to some things, and people get to make choices and say no. And so I think the conversation around should be cooperation and helping people want to participate and honoring their choices and giving them opportunity for choices. Compliance is maybe the wrong word, and I think the field's moving away from that, right, Bobby?
Yes, I believe that it is, and I hope that it is.
I'm glad.
Yeah, and for many of our individuals, again, that we're working with who've experienced some of this challenge, they have to be able to advocate for themselves. Yes. And say, I don't like this and I don't want to do it. And if it's mandatory, let's just say it's a test that we have to get. How can we then help them to get through it, as opposed to holding someone down or doing something? I think that's what's important. And so when we look at relatedness, one of the areas that I hope to maybe do some further research in is, don't put me near the peer that just aggressed towards me, or don't be that person that caused me trauma. When we're looking at relatedness, I need you to be my friend. And I think all of us, if we were sitting in an environment and we walked into an auditorium, you got to make choices, who you sat next to, who you didn't sit next to. You get to make a lot of choices every single day, from the moment that you wake up, the outfits that you pick, the things that you do, and our individuals are rarely exposed to that.
And how many teachers do they not like? I mean, I just had to fill out a form for my child about next year, and what I tried to convey in the how to pick your class for next year was find a teacher who genuinely likes my kid. Right. Because my child knows when you don't like them. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, often we see it as adults, that there's another adult who maybe isn't that likable or doesn't really like our child. And that can be a problem with relatedness. And kids know.
Absolutely. Right now, I think we probably have one of the best staff persons working with our son, Austin, and it's noted because Austin's leaving the house and going to places every single day with this person. And prior staff, he wouldn't budge from his room. And they did nothing other than, you could tell that they truly didn't want to be there and didn't like him. So he knows when the other person on the other side is there for him and there to support him, and someone he can trust. So, and when we look finally at fairness, when we're working at schools or in day programs, one of the things that I ask people often in day programs is it possible to just do the work with them? Why is it that you hand them some vocational type job and they have to do it themselves? Can you not just sit down next to them and do it with me? It's not something that needs to not be done by more than one person. Or in the school setting, can we look at compromise and choices? Can our children choose the order that they do things in? And can there be more compromise for them around the work schedule?
Okay, so we're going to lift up a little bit and just talk generally and sort of quickly about thinking about a strengths-based focus and well-being. So there has been some research around what helps adults have a sense of what researchers call subjective well-being. I have a pretty good life. I feel pretty happy. I feel good. These are people who are self-reporting how they feel about their own life. And in general, people often report feeling satisfied with their life when they're healthy, when they've had access to education, when they make enough to live and are well paid, when they feel good about the work that they do and have a sense of meaning in their work. Research has also correlated being religious and being married. I want to put a caveat on that. Researchers aren't sure if the connection to religion has to do with a sense of community or faith, or religion specifically. There's other research that has not found this tie. Similarly, married doesn't necessarily mean traditional man-woman legal marriage. It could mean a long-term relationship of different kinds in today's modern age. But you'll see a theme here that when you have access to things that, when you're well taken care of and you have a chance to learn and have meaning in your work and have relationships, people report being happier and feeling good about their life. There's some positive psychology research that looks at different characteristics. And behavior analysts don't talk about characteristics. We talk about behaviors that are associated or describe a characteristic. But for today, we're going to talk about these. So hope and zest for life, sort of a joyous enjoyment in life and a sense of hope and possibility, are highly related to feeling satisfied with your life. A sense of gratitude, feeling love, and feeling curious are also related statistically to people who report having a lot of life satisfaction. And intellectual strengths are weakly related. So what this research tells us about how people report what makes them feel satisfied is that when they have love, curiosity, they notice the good things. Remember that research earlier about what happiness interventions work for adults, gratitude, and feel zestful and have hope in life, they can feel a lot more satisfaction. So many times, as I mentioned, providers come in and we fix what's wrong. We want people to remember that there's a lot of strengths in ASD and in individual people, whether the child's good at memorizing certain topics, special interests, mechanical things. Think about the child's strengths and, next slide please, think about the strengths of the parents, teachers, siblings, community, and the setting. So when we go in, let's first think, what's going to help make this setting a happier, more joyful place full of love, curiosity, relationships, and what strengths do we have to build on? You can do a strengths-based assessment where you identify interests, things that are rewarding, family strengths, foster choice and control, create optimism, reduce stress, and reframe and focus on positive aspects of behavior. And this is the slide you're going to want to, if you watch the recording, pause and write some of these down. These are some of the steps we can take. And when you look at this list, you might notice autonomy and choice and control. Optimism ties back to happiness, right? Reducing stress and focusing on positive aspects of behavior. This is a reframing of a deficit model into one of a strengths model. And this, I can't remember, Bobby, was I going to do this section or you? We
Yes.
kind of went back and forth. Okay. So in quality of life as a practitioner, and now as a parent, when I'm talking with someone, I want my providers to think bigger picture. I want my school system to think bigger picture. Like, is my child satisfied with their life? And yes, even little kids can give you indicators if they're feeling happy on a day-to-day basis. Does my child have choice and control? Do I? Are there satisfying relationships? Do they like the learning environment? Is the learning meaningful? Am I happy as a family? These are the kinds of questions I want my school to be talking to me about. And even now I find I sometimes have to be a little more obvious about this piece in working with my educators because it's not always the focus. So there are several quality of life assessment tools. I kept this as a very tiny image on purpose because there's a long list and there's several different ones. Even in autism, there's a couple different quality of life assessments. They might be a nice tool to get people talking about, am I or is my child satisfied with their social life? Do we get to make our own decisions? Do we feel happy and content? Next slide. And here's another quality of life with similar questions. Are you satisfied with your current friendships? Can you be yourself around people? These are big, meaningful questions we need to be asking about our programs. Person-centered planning is a process-oriented approach to empowering people with disability labels. It focuses on the people and their needs by putting them in charge of defining the direction of their lives, not on the systems that may or may not be available to serve them. So on the next slide, you'll see that there's a list of different person-centered planning tools. And I would encourage you to, if you don't know about these, to maybe talk to your provider or to think about going through a person-centered planning process. There are structured processes to help people think big picture about how do these smaller interventions, including behavioral interventions, fit into the image I have for my life. And then Bobby's going to talk to us about how we are likable to children and how they like us back. So we're going to give you some strategies for how you can make that relationship stronger from the get-go.
And I hope they like me, right? So when we're looking...
Yeah. Liking is so important. And I think people forget that you have to like the student and the learner has to like you or you're going to get nowhere fast.
Yes, yes. And when you bring that up, I think one of important thing to even mention, I had just talked about this in a presentation not too long ago. When a child engages in certain challenging behaviors and when individuals place some sort of value on it in that they say the child is trying to get my goat or trying to get me. And I really talked about how that makes that child so unlikable because they're placing it in a different way by saying that the child is sort of wanting to. And then when we look at whether or not they can understand perspective taking and how whether they can even register that, how that maybe isn't the case or certainly isn't the case. But when we look at rapport in this area, in our area of behavior analysis, what we're looking at is that pairing process and really ensuring that the learning is enjoyable, that the treatment and what we're providing to them is fun, and that they really want to engage with us. And so we've got to be building these better relationships between the kids and the adults. As a parent and as an individual who also works in the field from trying to help parents, this is really a challenge for some. And I find that what we need to make sure that we're doing is also helping families to pair with their children again, because there may have been a long period of time in which the parent almost feels incapable of doing something, and they start to engage in more escape maintain behaviors, and maybe because they're feeling inept in this ability to build this rapport. So we've got to help them as well as us as therapists to be able to do this. So a relationship characterized by mutual liking, closeness, caring, and harmony. So be likable and like the other person. And again, as I had just said about our own son, Austin, as we're looking at this, he really has flourished in the last few weeks simply by having somebody in the room who wants to be there, who is enjoying their job and is so thrilled that he has this position now. And that has come out in him being able to go places and do more things and not engage in some challenging behaviors. But how did this person do that? How did they become Austin's friend? And one of the first things that they really did is they became the biggest reinforcer you could possibly imagine during the early stages. One of Austin's...
And I'm going to just warn you guys, these next few slides are going to have a lot of text. We're not going to read it. You'll have to pause and write notes later.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. But when Austin did, when this individual became the reinforcer, he just engaged in nothing but what Austin wanted to engage in. And when Austin wanted to be left alone, he let him be left alone. He really followed the lead of him, right? So when we look at how we could possibly make ourselves more reinforcing, the first thing is identifying those potential reinforcers, which may come from just watching, just observing, or it may have to come from more formal assessments. Helping to really control that environment so that you can navigate where the child goes, what they're going to do, and maybe how to approach them. But certainly approaching them with something fun that they've never, seen before, or something that you absolutely know they have an interest in. And I'll also point out not taking it too personally if they don't. And don't interrupt unless it's worth it to them. So coming in, turning off their favorite TV show and showing them, some light thing that spins around maybe isn't exactly what's going to make them want to be with you because it's not worth it to them. And I always remember the phrase, it should be more fun with you than without you. And so there are certain things that our children like that they need a second person for in order to make it fun. You can't throw a ball back and forth without a second person, but you can shoot hoops maybe without a second person. And so is this activity more fun with you or without you? And it should be. Be creative, be persistent, pair your voice with simple narration. If we're trying to get somebody to engage in demand activities, what you really should be doing after you give somebody something and then say, hey, take this cookie, but you're already kind of handing it to them so that your voice is paired with all these positive things. Just really, and as Robin said, you all can pause this to kind of look back and forth, but make yourself reinforcing to the individual that you're working with by looking at them and investigating that environment and really watching what they would prefer to do. Again, these are just ideas of things that you could possibly bring along with you. The ideas are unending. And I think many of us who do this out in the field and have these boxes in our car of things that we might find, and every time there's a new thing like the fidgets or something else, we're buying them up to make sure that we have them available in case they might be that one thing that brings it out in somebody. But then measuring. This is a part that I'm not sure if I see enough of in the field. And measuring not only just the rate of reinforcers that were delivered to somebody, we can count that maybe pretty easily, but possibly even measuring those approach behaviors and how often the child comes to us and we didn't have to go to them, or did they get closer to us? I think what we don't realize is that sometimes these steps might be very small that we have to take. Did the child sit on the same sofa as me this time around versus, pushing me off or not wanting me there? And certainly measuring these avoidance and escape behaviors and making sure that if you see that you've done something that's created them to push away or to go somewhere, that we're documenting that and not repeating it. And what are those happiness indicators? Are we looking at them that Robin mentioned earlier? Are we looking at measuring smiling and laughing? And what was it that they laughed at? And what are they looking at? And, I know that in our home we have videos that for some reason, even the 7,000th time that they've been watched, they bring incredible joy. So are we measuring that to see what it is about and looking at the video to see what's in it that happens, and then repeating this over and over again to make sure that we have a good picture of what this child is looking at, enjoys.
And the reason we do all of that so scientifically is to lay the foundation for future learning. And when you put the work in to develop the relationship and make the child really want to be with you as the teacher or the parent and in the learning environment, everything else flows better. Everything else, all the outcomes are better. So we'll end with a couple slides on mindfulness. I just want to bring to your attention, you can go ahead and move forward, that mindfulness interventions are now being investigated to reduce stress and help students cope and lower problem behaviors. They're definitely worth thinking about in your program for your kids and for you. There's examples here called the My Mind. It's a program. Accept, Identify, and Move is another curriculum that's out. You can go to the next slide. There are these curricula, one's called Optimistic Parenting by Mark Durand, and this AIM workbook is the Accept, Identify, and Move mindfulness-related curriculum for autism. So I would encourage you guys to consider this new line of research of mindful or attentiveness or meditation as a way to help reduce stress and help kids cope and parents cope. And again, the reason we do all of this, reduce stress, build happiness, think about quality of life, build relationships, is to facilitate learning, cooperation, and success overall. So all of these things underpin those outcomes we've identified at the beginning. They're not the only reason we do the program. They really do foster those outcomes and make things work better. So I think we just like to update you that things are better for my family. I've got a happy kiddo, being successful in school, lots of smiles, and not perfect, but a lot more joy, and I couldn't be happier. And so this has really worked for my family.
So this is my gang, and although in this picture, Chelsea and Alana are looking to sell their brother, Austin is really just a much happier individual now. When he was 10 years old and he went to Kennedy Krieger, he came out at the age of 11. He is now 26 years old and 6 feet tall, and I'm certainly happy that all of these behaviors are down to a minimum, but as a family that we can go out together and go to Disney and fly on airplanes and go places where he's just an unbelievably happy child, and that screech that I hear of happiness from him is just brings too much joy to ever see it go away again. And so all of these measures, then when we're bringing new staff on and when we're talking to new people, that effort that's taken in those first couple of weeks to just be and be with Austin the way he wants to be has made an unbelievable difference in Austin's life.
All right, great. So thank you both for that great presentation.
Absolutely.
And we'll start to take just a few questions. We've got we could probably do about 5 minutes if you've still got time.
Sure.
Okay, great. Well, one of the overarching themes of the question was about when you realize there's maybe not a good fit between a therapist and your child. What do you do as a parent? Like, how do you tactfully deal with that? Because typically a lot of families are in a situation where the intervention's being done by a larger clinic and people are just assigned and they don't have a lot of control over that. So have you got any strategies or suggestions how to navigate that diplomatically?
Well, I think from the provider perspective, there are these procedures we just talked about where not only can you help a child like someone else, but you can help the person like the child. So I think sometimes if you say neutrally, it seems like the relationship between my child and their instructor could be better. Could we look at doing some pairing procedures? Could we help build the relationship? Could work for some providers. I know some people don't necessarily have a lot of choice around saying I want someone different, but that might be an option too. I think for me, and I'll give Bobby a chance here in a second, the question is, how would we correct that relationship and make it rewarding for both of them? What do we need to slice back in our programming to build that rapport? That's just one idea.
Okay, so really working on rapport, not giving up too quickly?
I guess it depends on the situation, how bad it is, right, Bobby? I mean, there have been times where you see individuals who, frankly, maybe shouldn't be working with kids. They just aren't, they just don't like kids.
Yes. I'm going to say I've seen it both ways, where there's been somebody that I've had to actually say this isn't working out right away because the detriment that they may cause isn't worth it, because it could just increase that learning history that we're talking about before. And I don't have time sometimes to sort of allow that to happen. But at the other side of that is, if we're talking about sort of clinic-based services or even agency-based, is really talking to the head person about the procedures that they're using when they first get started with somebody. And if you have a response sort of like, well, we don't have time for that, or that's just not how we do it, or your child just needs to learn that he's got to work for some, that's a sort of a cultural challenge that I would have with the agency's perspective. Mm-hmm. If they have the mind, this way of saying, we're definitely going to start building rapport and maybe take a few steps back, I think you have a positive interaction there that you're going to maybe get some better feedback out of it, and ask for that positive part to be measured. Not just to say spend the next 2 weeks handing him candy, but to say, how are you going to measure this pairing process that we're going to back up to?
And because remember, the reason we do all of this, the reason we focus on strengths and happiness and bonding with the learning environment and the person, is to facilitate skill acquisition ultimately, so that the child can learn and grow. So there are scientific procedures that can help develop that, but some of you may be in situations where it's just not a good fit. I mean, I was told by an educator, life doesn't work that way, when I asked for a token system, and my child was 3. And so I pulled my child from the school, because when a teacher says flat out, no, I will not provide reinforcers for your child and I won't take data, that didn't work for me. Yeah.
So following, sometimes it'll come down to partially just following your instincts as a parent as well.
It depends on the resources you have, the instincts you have as a parent, and whether they're willing to cooperate and work through these questions with you. If you have a provider who's willing to say, yeah, I know, we're really struggling, and work through it with you and find new things that work, that's a good sign.
Okay. Next question. I had several questions about functional behavioral analysis, and I think you touched on that a tiny bit, but maybe you could talk about, one, what that would look like for a school if you were going to send somebody in, if you were going in to do one as a BCBA, and then also how valuable that is to the process. Is it a crucial part of getting that classroom right, or are there other strategies that you recommend, or both?
I would say functional behavior assessment, for those of you who don't know what it is a structured process of interviews, observations, and sometimes arranging the environment to test a theory about the behavior, to try to identify why the person's engaging in the behavior, and then to cultivate and create positive plan around supporting the person in the environment, getting their needs met in socially appropriate ways. Research has shown that understanding the why of the behavior is a powerful way to address it ethically, effectively, and positively. So I would encourage people who are struggling with challenging behavior to get a qualified person for their child into the classroom who can do this kind of scientific analysis correctly. Like any procedure that you might do in any clinical or psychological procedure, you want somebody who's highly qualified, who's going to be working with your child. I do think it's a valuable procedure when done well. Bobby, what would you say about that?
Well, I want to add to that because I agree with all that you're saying, but I also want to add that if we don't do a functional behavior assessment, and what I would call the trouble with trying, and meaning that when people try too many procedures without actually conducting the assessment and understanding what the function is and applying strategies that may be evidence-based, but evidence-based for a different function, that we can create more challenges, or we can even shape up a new function for a behavior if we're addressing it incorrectly. So I'm adamant about functional behavior assessments being conducted, especially when the function is not clearly obvious, and often with our children it's not.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not necessary for every child, but for a lot of kids who have complex issues, it really is the gold standard.